mostly. But for more generally, I'm interested in the use of biotechnologies in agriculture and food systems. And so I do a lot of public outreach around the use of genetic engineering, particularly, or GMOs, if you want to use the common term, in food production, which is obviously a really controversial area. But my own research program, I have a molecular lab at UC Davis with graduate students and postdocs, is focused very much on using some of these tools in livestock breeding, and so particularly more recently some of the genome editing tools like CRISPR-Cas9, which is kind of the sexy one at the moment. And so that's what I do from a research perspective. So my job is 75% outreach and extension and 25% research.
And so could you kind of explain like how you even like got into this field? Because I think when I was a small girl, I was like, oh, vet school. But I very quickly changed away from like medicine and veterinary medicine because I was like, oh, I'm interested in the science way more than the practice.
Yeah, so I guess that if you can not tell from my accent, I'm Australian, and grew up in Melbourne, just outside of Melbourne. And when I was at school, I was really interested in science and also animals. So it was kind of it was a blend of two things that interested me. I actually, along the gender kind of discussion, I went to an all-girls school. And that, so it wasn't seen as abnormal or weird that you would do well in math and science. It wasn't, you didn't have to pretend not to be smart. It was okay to be good at math and science. And that's what really interested me. And so I actually got into agricultural science at the University of Melbourne. That was the course that I wanted to go to and enrolled in. And that's kind of was spurred at the time. So I'll tell you my age. I'm 50, almost 58. So I was born about 63. So about 10 years after DNA was described by Watson and Crick. So, and about 10 years before recombinant DNA kind of started being a thing. So when I was kind of growing up, it wasn't like my field even really existed. So I didn't have dreams as a child of being, a molecular geneticist because that didn't exist. So I think that you can't always predict what you're going to do when you grow up because maybe your job doesn't even exist yet. I don't imagine that you were, as a kid, thought you would be a Zoom host. Maybe even
no,
a year
not at
ago.
all.
Maybe even a year ago, you didn't think you'd be a Zoom host.
Uh,
Yeah, so you have to stay somewhat flexible there. But when I completed my bachelor's degree, I actually did my senior year as an exchange student at the University of California. There's the Education Abroad program. And that was when I really got hooked on Davis. It's such a great school. And I met a professor there who said, why don't you come back for a master's? And then I did my master's with them and my PhD with them and never left, kind of. So that was my gateway drug, I guess, was getting into the UC for my senior year. So that's kind of my career trajectory, but it's not quite that linear, to be honest. So I worked for a couple of years in Australia for an animal health company before I went back to do my master's. After my master's, I stopped because I was sick of school and I went and worked for a few years as an extension specialist. During my PhD, I had my 2 kids, and so that kind of derailed me from getting a real job for a few years. And I actually didn't start my current job until relatively old and relatively late. So I've been in this job for 20 years, but that was, I kind of started that, if I'm 58, I've started at 38. So that's kind of late to come in and start as an assistant professor. But I guess that was what had to happen for had to move countries and find something that I liked and loved to do. And that's what I do. I have found, and so I feel fortunate in that way, but it wasn't a really straight path from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I kind of find that now, the longer that I'm in science, I realize that there are so many more avenues to get to the same place. So there are many ways to get there, even when choosing majors. And so do you think that your path would have been any different if you'd gone to like a co-ed school versus your experience in a all-girls school?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's you can't relive your life, and you can't do a controlled experiment to answer that question, right? So, I do think so. It was pretty traditional roles back in when I was at school in Australia, and like the expectation is that you'd find a good husband and marry well is the expression that they use, and then you would basically become a stay-at-home wife, and they would, because they're making a lot of money, they would look after you, kind of thing. And so a lot of my friends at the time actually, that was their path, and that was not something that really appealed very much to me. So I was always very focused on my education. I give credit to my mum for insisting that I went to an all-girls school, because she really, I think, both my mum and dad appreciated the value of an education, and she wanted the same for her girls as for her son. And so it was never even like, was never really even thought about that I might not do something professional when I finished. And so I guess I do credit my family for kind of instilling that in me. But even so, I went obviously to a co-ed university, and yeah, even there, there was a lot of bullying, and you wouldn't say what marks you got in tests and stuff, because it was kind of seen as nerdy to do really well, and so you just kind of hit it a bit. That's a little bit. There's this thing called the tall poppy syndrome in Australia, where if you're you do well in a field, that they chop down the tall poppies. So there's kind of this self-depreciating kind of uh, attitude, and so it's just an awkward place to excel academically as a woman. And I hope it's
Very,
changed. um,
yeah, that's a very different experience. And I kind of also want to ask about what the demographics were like in university, because I think nowadays in biology, if I use biology as a major, I think the demographics is more girls than guys right now.
Yeah, I think it depends on the field. And so as I said, I did agricultural science, which was a little bit more tilted towards men, I think, but not like, there was a lot of women that were in my class as well. So I don't think it was that crazy. It tended to be, and this is really sexist, but like engineering tended to have more men than women, and some of like arts and stuff would have more women than men. So there's a little bit of just like, I don't know, gender distribution of in different courses. But yeah, I think that what happens is often as women start to enter the workforce and get married and have children, they kind of, there's this, you've heard of this probably, the kind of the leaky pipeline. So people drop out because it's
Mhm.
too hard to, and I actually, I'm going to, I'm having a look at the questions that are coming in, and one of them is, how do you find balancing your personal life as a mother and a professional life in academia? What's the hard thing, and what advice would you offer to women who find themselves in similar situations at some points in their life? I'm not going to lie, balancing children and academia, especially like at a university like Davis, where you have to research and get grants and publish, that kind of timetable doesn't really care that you have children. um, and it's been hard. I guess my best advice would be, pick your spouse very carefully, because I have a tremendous husband, and he's been so hands-on in terms of sharing, diaper changing and getting up at night and all the rest of it. So, the only thing I did on my own, I guess, was gestate the kids. But once they were born, it was very much a 50-50 deal. And so I think it's particularly hard in academia, and it has improved since when I went through, it was just like, you just kind of pretended that nothing was going on. You kept working at the same pace as everybody else. It was just kind of like you had this going on in the background, and you didn't even hardly discuss your family. I think now it's much more kind of it's part of the discussion, and the tenure clock stops for a year now if you have a child or adopt a child. And so I think there's a little bit more. I wouldn't say it's great, especially the US is has pretty minimalist family leave policies and things like that, versus some other countries you get like a whole year or something. And I think I had 6 weeks and so that, and then you were back at work, and that's not a lot of time even to recover from the physical aspects of birthing, let alone dealing with, you're so exhausted in those young years. You're like a blithering idiot in terms of, it's hard to think clearly when you're that tired, and to have to get up and be at work at 8 if the kid's been up all night. That there's no easy way, but that's just motherhood. I don't care if you're in academia or not. I think you just it's a very tiring time of your life. So that would be, I guess, my answer to that one.
Yeah, and I'm also like personally quite interested in that question too, because I was always told, if I wanted to have a family, I should not go in academia. This is what my mom told me, who was also in academia.
Yeah.
And so like, how do you even navigate that kind of stigma and like the pressure that other people put on you to perform well in academia, but also, having a family and being a good mother?
Maybe I'm not. Maybe we should ask my kids. My kids are in college age now, so I've probably done the damage I'm going to do at this stage. It's not easy. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, and it is a hard profession to kind of combine with families. But there are lots. That's true for many professions, I think. I certainly don't have the magic sauce. Like I said, having a supportive partner is really important. And when my kids were little, if you look at my speak, you mentioned I speak a lot, and I do. During the young years, I didn't. And during the young years, I wasn't as productive as I could have been if I didn't have kids. And I think it's on average, it's every kid you have is something like a 5-paper penalty. So that's you on average write 5 less papers over your lifetime as compared to people of the same age that didn't have family. So it's real. And it's like, fine, okay, I don't mind having a 5-paper penalty. I'd rather have my kid, And so I think you just have to accept that. And so it will affect your career in the long run. But that's the balance you choose or you make. And so I don't know how you get around that, because you are going to have competing interests for your time. And so you're not going to be doing the same level of productivity that you were before the little bundles of joy arrived.
And do you think that penalty is the same for men whose like wives have children?
It's not, and I'm citing research here. It's not just my personal observation. Yeah, there's been a couple of papers that have looked at this, and even during the pandemic, looking at people, women with family, young family at home versus those without, and yeah, it doesn't affect men in the same way. And yeah, I'll leave it to the audience to judge why that might be. I think, yeah, it's partly perhaps who's doing the bulk of the childcare in many partnerships. It falls disproportionately on the women, especially when you're nursing. It's hard to, and bless my husband, I used to pump, and that night feeding, he would actually get up and defrost breast milk and give it to the kids so I could sleep through for a couple of hours, and kind of, so they can help in ways like that. So but yeah, I think it's just it is often the woman that's doing the lion's share, and that's really, it's between you and your partner. Like, there's no right way to do that. And so maybe if you've got a partner that wants to have all the childcare responsibilities, then you may not even have that penalty. I think it kind of depends on how you work with your partner as to how's this going to work for us. And I think it's hard to overestimate how much time. I kind of thought that they'd lay in a little bassinet, and like I could still write my papers, and they'd cry occasionally, and I'd give them coo them, and then they go back to sleep. And that's really not how they work at all. You're like, I'm this competent human, and I'm like can hardly get through the day here, let alone, think about doing any work. Yeah, it really knocks you.
Yeah, as a single woman who has no husband or children, it's like difficult enough already. And I think having children, I want to have children, but I'm also terrified of the thought of the time and energy that goes into having children. But I also know that it'll be fulfilling.
They're so cool though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally worth it. So yeah, everyone has to make, and when's a good time to do it is always, especially in academia, do you do it during your graduate studies, during your postdoc, when you're assistant professor? So I kind of sneakily had my kids so at the end of my PhD, and then I actually went to work for a company here in town, and that was Calgene. It's a biotech company that made the Flavor Saver tomato, and I had my second kid there, and then after that was when I started as an assistant professor. But that was just dumb luck, right? It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to plan to, have my children in private industry and then move to academia after. It was just, that's when the jobs came up and stuff. So the one thing I promised myself and my family is I wouldn't move the kids during school. So, and that really hurts women from a career advancement point of view. So you get offers from, to be the chair of a department here or whatever, and you just can't move. Or I chose not to disrupt the kids' education and their friends, and just stuff that kids don't want to move to another place, and so that like limits your kind of opportunities to some extent, but it's a choice that everyone has to make themselves. But it's really common in academia to move to 2 or 3 or 4 universities. You get deanship here, and then you do whatever, depending what you want to do, you move around to advance, and that I think is much less common in women, especially if they have family. So that there's kind of, what I find is there's less obvious kind of pullbacks on your career at my level, but there's kind of these little invisible things like that, and you haven't been as productive when you're young, and so like you don't have as many publications, so your H index suffers from that. And so there's all these little things that happen because of kids that aren't obvious, but it kind of does have an impact on your career progression.
And so in terms of like the difference between like academia and industry, is there like a really big difference between that research for agricultural and genomic sciences between academia and industry?
Yeah, I mean, so I worked for Calgene for 3 years, and then I've been in academia for 20. And so I guess the beauty of working for a company is someone else is taking care of getting the supplies and resources and everything. So it's like you just walk in and you open up a pipette box and you use them, and you use your tack, and you've got a nice walk-in -80 freezer, and that's all paid for, and you don't have to write grants, but you have to work on whatever that company is working on. And so at the fundamental basic level, DNA is DNA. It doesn't matter if you're looking at it at a company or at the university, but the projects you're working on are going to be whatever that company is working on. And in the case of Calgene, it was plants. Well, that was fine because DNA is DNA, but that wasn't really my interest. So it was great for a short term, and I loved how well stocked those labs were. And it was just, but then I got to work on what I really like, which is animals. But then now I'm responsible for everything. So, I have to write grants for the pipette boxes and to pay the graduate students and the postdocs. And it's a multi-million-dollar enterprise that you're running. And it's a little scary sometimes. Like, am I going to be able to keep the wheels on the bus and keep getting grants to like pay everybody? And so you move from having total control over what you do, but also being effectively financially liable for it all. And so that aspect is not so much fun, but the creativity and the ability to do the research that interests you is fun. So those are kind of the trade-offs, I think. So I guess I certainly worked less hours when I worked for a private company, and partly my kids were little, and so I was already exhausted. So like at 5 o'clock, I would go home. In academia, I don't even want to talk about it.
And so do you think like the support for women, especially like women with kids, do you think the support is the same in academia as in industry?
I mean, that I can only go. I think that there's better paternal leave, or no, maternal,
Maternal.
parental
Oh,
leave. That's what
parental.
I was looking for. Parental leave with some of the companies, and some companies have like daycares and stuff like that, which all would have been nice. But the university has a daycare too, and it's not inexpensive. It's incredibly expensive to have kids, by the way. But yeah, I guess I've never felt unsupported by either place having kids, but I there wasn't really much help either. So it was like, oh, that's nice, you're having a kid, but you still need to do everything. And so good luck with that, is kind of how it was, and that was fine. We lived through it, we made it, and the kids turned out okay, I think.
And so I'm just going to go back towards like the more fundamental part. So like regarding to like agriculture and genomic sciences, are there any stereotypical like stigmas associated with women? Like I know for engineering, my brother has a saying that all the girls are either dumb or ugly. Is what
that's
the engineer said.
Lovely.
And so is there like a sort of stigma or saying that in agricultural and genomic sciences?
I mean, genomics is, I think, a new enough field that it's pretty much gender balanced for the most part. And so I think, I can think of some successful women and some successful men in like bioinformatics and stuff like that. So I don't know that agricultural sciences more generally, however, that tends to, especially kind of the industry, there's quite a bit of kind of old school thinking and a little bit misogynistic kind of attitudes towards women, and I guess I just, I'm like, fine, you're welcome to your opinion, but I'm going to demonstrate that I'm actually really competent by doing really well, and giving really good talks, and understanding the issues that are being faced, and trying to have a discussion around it in a way that resonates with my audience. That's kind of what you do when you're trying to communicate anything, right? And so I think, I may not agree with everybody's opinions about everything, but I have shared goals of trying to improve the efficiency of agricultural production. And so that's kind of where I'll narrow my discussion with people, and that I might not have the same political views with, and maybe they even have different views around whether, women in the workplace. That's fine. We can disagree on that, and we don't even really need to discuss it. We can just get on with what our shared goals are. And that's where I think you need to be a little bit aware of who you're talking to, and try to have a civil discourse around that. And that's I find really hard on Zoom, because there's no audience feedback. So, you can't see whether people are nodding with you, or they're sitting like this with their eyes squinted or whatever. There's nothing there. And so it's really hard to do presentations on Zoom, because you've got no idea if you're
I'm
landing.
Like also kind of looking at Discord, and there are like a lot of really great comments. People are saying, oh, CRISPR is the sexy one. There's a lot of nods for that. About getting married, a lot of comments. I'm like trying to do multiple things, but I do agree that Zoom does make it really hard to do a presentation, but it also enables us to like do this really collaborative thing of people around the world, because you're in California, I'm in South Carolina. Anshit, who is the owner of the server, he's in India.
Okay, yeah.
He's actually sitting in lab right now.
In lab.
He's in lab right now.
At class. I hope you're paying attention to the professor then, if you're.
I think he's running a gel. I think he's running a gel. So I do like agree that there are like things that aren't as nice with Zoom, but there are also some things that are kind of nice.
I totally agree. The global reach is been really fun this last year, in terms of like conferences that have gone virtual, and suddenly now we have, you know, several participants from Africa or whatever that would have never normally been able to participate. So it's certainly helped accessibility, I think, for some of these conferences.
Absolutely. I do have another question. As a woman in science, I have found myself having to become far more assertive and defensive of myself in order to succeed and be taken seriously. What is your thoughts on this? Is this something you've also experienced, or does this depend on different work cultures?
Yeah, women have, like, there's this balancing thing you have to do where if you come across too assertive, then, you know, you get labeled as something derogatory, and you're seen as, you know, pushy or whatever. But if you're too timid, then, you know, you never get heard. And so you do have to be assertive, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't put people off. And so often I think humor is a good way to do that. But, you know, if you're, and I see this a lot where you'll get cut off, you know, you're in the middle of at a meeting and you're in the middle of a sentence and some guy will just like come in and cut you off. And it's like, okay, just, can I just finish my thought? You know, you try and be a little bit like not confrontational about it, even though you might be sitting there seething. And I think it is a hard balance to try to continue to be, you know, all of the traits that are expected of a woman in terms of collegial and you know, getting along, and we do tend to do that, I think, as a gender, but then also having your points heard. And I think I found I had more trouble when I was younger, and that's probably true for any younger academic. You know, you don't get the same. It takes a while to establish your reputation, and I think that's one thing. It's taken me longer to establish my reputation than I think it might have otherwise. But part of that was because I wasn't traveling a lot, I wasn't speaking a lot, and I was home with the kids. And not home with the kids, I was working full time, but I wasn't traveling when the kids were little. And so I didn't really, in fact, one of my dear colleagues, he goes, "Where did you come from? Because all of a sudden you're everywhere." And it was like, well, I was home looking after my family, right? And now I can travel. And so now I am able to be, quote, everywhere. I wouldn't say I was everywhere, but that's, you know, and I think, and I do find now there's a lot more sensitivity to having better balanced panels, so that, you know, the manel is becoming an unfashionable thing, and so there's a lot of invitations now for women speakers and also speakers of color to try to have a more diverse audience, or panelists at conferences, which is a really good thing, because there were several years when it was just all men, men, and you'd see, you know, young men would just get way more opportunities than young women, and that's, I think, is starting to change.
And so related to that, do you think like there was a specific turning point in which like events became more open to having women be at the forefront?
I know in my field there was this one particular international conference that's held every 4 years. It's kind of like the Olympics, if you will, and it was maybe 8 years ago. I think it was 8 years ago. They had every single plenary speaker was male, and the audience was about 50, if not 60% female. And there was a group of kind of my age people that just had a go at the organizer, like just said, this is never happening again. And so we're now on that organizing committee and are really, you know, sensitive to that. So I think it was almost this is ridiculous. This is whatever year it was. And it's like, and there's plenty of good women in this field. So historically, there was a time when some of the senior academics would all be male. And so there was, you know, maybe an understandable skew. But in today's world, that's no longer true. And so to just continue to ask your buddies because it's easy. Or I actually had one gentleman tell me that he wanted me to moderate a panel, and I looked at the panel and it was all men. It was on CRISPR, actually, sexy CRISPR. And I said, "Oh, you don't have any women?" And he said, "Well, I don't know any women doing interesting work in CRISPR." I was like, I still can't. It was like, really? Yeah. So that, and, you know, not letting people get away with comments like that in this day and age. And you don't need to do it in a, you know, aggressive way, but it's like, come on. I don't know, Jennifer Doudna, for example, just there's one perhaps, you know, it's just, yeah, kind of
And
funny.
so related to that, how do you navigate going into like academia and trying to, you know, go up in your career and making sure that you are heard, but also like, I feel like there's this like sweet spot of being really political about it, but and tactful, but then also making sure that, you know, there is a stopping point where you can't be tactful anymore.
Yeah, I guess it's your own level of tolerance for such things. And I think it's a little easier now to point things out than it was when I was younger. You know, it would just kind of be accepted that it was like an all male panel, that no one would even raise an eyebrow. Whereas now you'll get some heat for that because you're not trying, you know. And so I think that you need to pick your battles. So I guess you don't want to be known as the angry woman, but at the same time, you don't want to be known as the pushover, right? And so, I mean, I think anyone that knows me knows that I have a pretty firm opinion, and I will say what I think if something's not okay. And I think more women are starting to speak up now, and you're seeing so, you know, some of the deplorable behavior that's been tolerated in academics at conferences, and, you know, just in like so inappropriate you can't even put it into words. That stuff's getting called out, and there's consequences now, and there didn't used to be, you know, and maybe the Me Too movement has kind of really solidified all of that, but I think it's just less tolerated now than it used to be, and it just wouldn't occur because it's now politically incorrect to behave like that, and people will call you out, and male colleagues will stand right alongside you and do the same thing too. So I think there's some support there from the kind of male academics who see stuff going on and they're like, no, not okay. So I think that's improving.
And I think something that that I think not only girls have seen in like who are younger, but also guys have seen, but this is a comment from one of our attendees that it is frustrating that they've experienced where they've experienced it takes a male colleague to say the same thing that you have been saying for it to be taken seriously. And so like, do you have any advice for that, or how do you navigate?
It is incredibly frustrating. It still happens, especially I find on social media, and so on Twitter particularly. And there's actually one of the people on my Twitter feed is this guy called, I think he's called Angry Chef, One Angry Chef or something. And he had this really classic tweet one time. He goes something like, you know, he made some observation and he said, of course, women have been saying this for many years, but now a man said it, so it's true. I mean, he was self-deprecating. It was just hilarious because I see that a lot. And so I'll see, you know, people say exactly the same things as women, you know, might have been saying. And it's like, oh, that's a really great point, you know. And what am I, mincemeat? So it's just, and that's actually true in citations in terms of citing papers and stuff. And so there's all these little hidden penalties that they're not overtly there, but it like, so therefore, you know, that affects your H index and kind of your notoriety and stuff like that you never even think about, or getting asked on collaborations, and you know, they'll go with their mates or whatever, and so there's less likelihood to include women on that. And I think that's changing too, but historically that's been very much true. And so you get this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where the funding goes to a group of colleagues that then are teamed with those colleagues for the next round of funding, and they're more competitive because you didn't get funding, you know. And so it kind of, it's a cycle that never stops. And so I've actually noticed some of the granting agencies now just have you fill out your initials. So, you know, AB Jones instead of whatever, to try to get rid of that implicit bias, even in grant reviews. And I know some of my early grant reviews were, oh, I don't think that, you know, she can do this. Looking back at them, it's very clearly they've just decided that I'm not going to be a good scientist. And, you know, I haven't had the opportunity to even prove whether I'm going to be a good scientist. And that implicit bias is really hard to resolve, because it's not even overtly there. You don't even know it's happening. And yeah, so I think things like just removing descriptors that kind of, even whose grant is it, who cares whose grant it is, why do you even need to know that? Look at the grant and then judge it based on that is probably a move that could help some of that kind of stuff.
And so what do you think was the greatest challenge you had to overcome when you started your career, like in terms of these biases? And do you think like younger generations will still have to go through these challenges, or like has it improved enough?
I mean, I haven't been a man in science, so I can't really speak from I haven't done the controlled experiment. But when you first start out, I think it's just establishing a reputation, and that I just remember. You get a desk and a lab, which is lovely, but everything's up to you from then on out. Like, there's no money, and so I just remember kind of sitting at the desk, and I'm like, now what do I do? It's like, so you're starting entirely, whatever you want to do is it's up to you, and then you need to find money to do it. And so just getting started those first few grant rejections are just soul destroying. I just remember curled up in my bed crying. I'm like, I'm never going to make it in academia. I'm a loser. And so that the imposter syndrome is very, very strong in those early years. And it's still there, but you just try and deal with it. So I think it's not unusual to get some rejections, and it's not unusual to feel that, you're hopelessly underqualified for your job. I think that's quite normal. And I think we need to just be honest and say it so that young faculty don't think they're the only ones feeling it.
How do you even get over imposter syndrome? Because imposter syndrome is I still get imposter syndrome, like with everything that I do. Like, do I even deserve to be doing science? Do I deserve to be even getting paid for doing this? None of my experiments work anyway.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure that most people don't feel it, actually, to some extent. It's maybe we're more vocal about it. It's just, I guess my attitude in the first early years was just work hard, put your nose down, and just get your pubs going, and get your reputation established. And so I did very little controversial outreach in my early years around GMOs and stuff. I needed to establish a solid scientific reputation before I stuck my head up for that game. And that, I enjoy doing it, but it also comes with its own reputational challenges when some of the activists and anti-GMO groups go after you. And so I think you need to have a good, solid foundation of legitimate science to be able to withstand some of that potential career defamation from those types of groups.
And so now that you're in the more kind of controversial area where people are definitely coming at you, how do you deal with those too? Not just as a woman, but as a scientist?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard with social media, which can so rapidly amplify misinformation. And I think it's, I've argued that agricultural scientists have been dealing with misinformation for 30 years, basically. Like when I grew up, it was actually good to be a farmer, and people appreciated food. Now it's like it seems like they're the enemy. And especially around agriculture, there's so much kind of misinformation. And people that do put their hands up, do tend to get whacked. And I've watched that with the vaccine doctors in the kind of the COVID era, getting whacked by some of the vaccine people too. And I think you just have to kind of band together with colleagues and just weather it out, because at the end of the day, we have to make decisions based on objective truths. We can't do it based on someone's opinion. And so I guess, to me, I'm passionate enough about agriculture and the importance of feeding people that I'm willing to try to speak up about it. But I don't know, I guess for me, mute is a pretty good little feature on these apps. So you don't have to listen to, someone railing on you. And, normal people will have a discourse with you, and so fine, and that's great. And that's who you want to reach. Total aggressive nut jobs, I'm not that interested in that discourse, and so I just mute them and then go on your way. I guess you don't have to get in an argument, although you would think on Twitter that's the only thing you do. But actually, there's lots of people that are just lurking and watching. And that's really who you're trying to reach. It's not someone that's aggressively going after you.
And so, what is the biggest misconception about your field?
Well, I mean, I think that somehow genetic engineering creates unsafe food. And so, like, I'm not sure why else everyone's, try to buy non-GMO water, right? It just makes no sense. Why are you doing that? And so it's been an issue that has been very hard to kill that zombie, if you will. So every, the same old studies get cited again and again and again, despite literally every scientific society in the world's opinion that this doesn't introduce novel hazards or risks. And so that's been frustrating. And it's a little bit like, the vaccine stuff too. It's like the overwhelming evidence is that this is better than getting COVID. So that shouldn't be a hard message when it's actually people's lives at risk. And so what hope do we have with GMO food if people won't even look at that relative risk benefit ratio of vaccines and get vaccinated? So I think it's science communication is struggling with that at the moment.
And you are a very excellent science communicator. You do a lot of stuff like on TV, you do your blog. So what is your favorite part about science communication? If you have one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so we did have, I don't know if you saw the Intelligence Squared debate where they have two people arguing for a topic and two people against a topic. And that particular debate was really well moderated. And it went for like an hour and a half. It's an Oxford style debate in the middle of New York City. And I was like, oh, good luck. And that particular debate, the moderator was really good about keeping it on the science and just trying to no, there wasn't any, hearsay or crazy thing. It was just all, and if you can actually sit people down in a room for an hour and a half and have a discussion around the facts, what happened was quite a number of that audience went from uncertain to being supportive of utilizing genetic engineering in food, which was not what I expected in New York City, to be honest, an urban audience with no idea of any problems that might be addressed by this technology. So I think that was really satisfying. And it was a very, I love metrics, of course, I'm a scientist. So you could actually see people that weren't sure listening and then saying, you know what, I think that those are good arguments. I'm gonna go with that. And it was like, that's super satisfying. You don't often get that metric right there in your face. I mean, the other thing that I did was in that movie Food Evolution, which is on Hulu, that talks about GM. And that was a really interesting exercise interacting with filmmakers who have a very different skill set to me, and were able to tell the story in a way that I would have never thought of doing it. That's very compelling and kind of, making a narrative around it that I wouldn't have thought of doing. And so that partnership between kind of the left-brained filmmakers and the kind of right-brained scientists was really, really fun. And it was just fun seeing how movies get made. And so that was a really good experience.
Also, I kind of related to that. I saw that you called out CNN for that, I think a documentary where they didn't even really ask any agricultural scientists of how they felt. How do you feel about stuff like that?
It frustrates the living heck out of me because when we're talking about vaccines, you talk to Dr. Fauci or Dr. Hertz, right? So people whose actual expertise is in that area. When we talk about agriculture, it seems like they go to everyone else that has no scientific expertise in this area, and they don't understand the trade-offs of some of what they're talking about. And it's so important to look at risks and benefits of anything, or trade-offs, as I call it. And so if you're pushing one particular type of agriculture, you need to understand, well, what would be the consequences of that particular style of agriculture, and why are people not doing it now, and what problems are they facing that makes them not be able to do that, and maybe it's weed pressure, or it's insects, or it's there's not enough water, or whatever. But it's really complicated because you're working with a biological system, and these kind of simplistic narratives where just, well, let's just get rid of all animals. It's like, okay. Do you have any idea what that would do to the ecosystems? So things like that I find really frustrating. And there are experts at literally in every state in the nation. There's a land grant university, literally, with experts that don't have any dog in this fight, so to speak. They're not selling anything, that would easily be able to address this. And a lot of people get their information from movies and media like that. And if you don't know any differently, and all you've ever heard is this point of view that's not supported by the science, and the same with the anti-GMO stuff, then you don't even know that what you believe is not correct, because you've never actually heard anyone make a different point. And so that happens often with GMO stuff. It's like, you're pro, you're supportive of using this technology, and it's like, yes, and so I think that it becomes established fact when in fact it's not. And I feel like the media has to do a better job at actually presenting information that's backed by research. And if there is a legitimate dispute, not just some crazy guy, but actually 50% of the scientists think this and 50% of the scientists think that, I think they need to present that appropriately balanced. And often you'll get it presented with a very false balance where 99% of scientists think climate change is happening, and then one person doesn't, or whatever, and they'll get equal time in the interests of both siderism. But actually the view they present therefore is very skewed, because they're kind of giving equal weighting to both viewpoints, which is not what the data supports. And so I think it does frustrate me. And I don't know why agricultural scientists never get asked about agriculture. It's very strange.
And then another related question, do you know where this entire anti-GMO sentiment came from? How it originated?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I mean, historically, it kind of was the way that GMOs were introduced in the early days into Europe. There was a lot of the anti-GMO sentiment comes from Europe and some of the green groups there. And initially, it was a technology that didn't have a track record, and so there was a lot of fear mongering around it, and frankenfood kind of stuff like that. And that's fine. But now we've got 30 years of data, and known health associates effects, and basically the anti-GMO sentiment has really blocked several things. And I don't know if you saw yesterday, but golden rice, which has been basically 30 years in the making, was finally approved for cultivation. And so that's a great victory. But my gosh, how many generations of kids have not had access to that rice because of this, basically real harm happening because of misinformation that's not that's stopping these products coming to market. So it's a long story, but now it's been monetized by the non-GMO project and the organic industry and stuff. Now it's become, I'm going to sell you a more expensive product that avoids this horrible thing that will give you kids cancer. And it's like, no, it won't. But I'm going to buy your non-GMO water just to be sure.
My supermarket sells non-GMO firewood.
Oh, good. Well, I kind of think if you want to spend your money on that, you're welcome. But I know I'm horrible to go shopping with, because my husband actually says, don't you come along, because it just frustrates me. And it's unfortunately it's to me monetizing fear that you've placed into consumers, and you're taking their money from them for this risk that doesn't exist. And so it's like the most disingenuous way to make a living is selling the same product that's, it's like selling unicorn poo free scones, right? So these scones don't have any unicorn poo. And you're like, oh, thank God, I'm going to buy those ones because the other ones don't say that. So maybe they have unicorn poo in them. And so you kind of cast this aspersion on conventional products. And then you have this halo and you charge more for your absence labeled product. Well, it didn't have anything in there in the first place. So, it's all you're doing is saying there's no unicorn poo. Well, if there was no any unicorn poo to start with, then what's the point of your label? Yes, it's actually genius marketing if you think about it.
Yeah, they charge like 3 times more for it.
Yeah,
it looks exactly the same.
Right.
But we're about ready to close up now, and I want to thank you very sincerely for this entire time. Even though this is meant to be a panel,
I feel like
I'm to be an interview.
I'm representing the entire female half of the population here.
I think we did get a really good insight into your experiences, not just like as a women scientist, but also as a mother, and how it's different for men. And so I want to thank you sincerely for doing this panel and for spending this time with us.
Okay, you're welcome, Candice, and thank you to an anonymous audience out there, wherever you may be.
Thank you so much, and thank you, audience. We have another talk coming up soon, and so y'all have